I'm Edward, and I'm truly grateful you've chosen to spend this quiet evening hour with us. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop it in the comments below, because one of my favourite things is picturing all of you, settled in your own corners of the world, joining us for these gentle gatherings. Have you ever found yourself on a late-night train, watching the darkened countryside slip past the window, wondering about the strangers sharing your carriage? The soft rhythm of the rails, the flicker of passing lights, the quiet hum of the engine. There is something both comforting and unsettling about a night journey, isn't there? Tonight, that feeling matters more than you might expect. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an evening story from our cosy community. We gather here every day, and there is always a mystery waiting. Now settle back, let your thoughts grow still, let the world outside fade away, and let's step into tonight's mystery together. The last train to Much Benham is about to depart. Chapter 1. The Last Departure. The evening of the 14th of March arrived in St Mary Mead the way most troubling things do, quietly and without any particular fuss. A thin frost had settled over the garden walls by 5:30, and the last pale light was retreating behind the church tower when Miss Jane Marple set down her teacup with the particular deliberateness of a woman who's just remembered something important. The fire in her sitting room was doing its best against the cold, and her knitting, a second sleeve for a cardigan she had begun in November, lay temporarily forgotten across her lap. She had been thinking about trains. More specifically, she had been thinking about the 9:47 evening service from St Mary Mead Halt to Much Benham, which passed through 3 small stations, carried no more than a dozen passengers on a weekday evening, and which had, until this morning, seemed entirely unremarkable. Until Mrs. Bantry had telephoned. "Dead Jane, Dolly," Bantry had said in that breathless way she had when the news was both dreadful and, one suspected, rather exciting. Found in the last carriage, old Mr. Winfield. The stationmaster at Much Benham found him when the train terminated, just sitting there, perfectly upright with his hat still on. The inspector says it was his heart. Miss Marple had said, "Dear me," which was her customary response to information that required considerably more thought than it appeared to warrant. She had then asked 3 questions. Had Mr. Winfield been known to suffer from a heart complaint? Had anyone else been seen in the last carriage that evening? And, most particularly, had his small leather travelling case been found beside him? Mrs. Bantry had not known the answer to any of these questions, which was in itself informative. Mr. Reginald Winfield had been, until his retirement some 8 years prior, the senior clerk at Hartley & Sons, the solicitors whose offices occupied the upper floor of the old market building in Much Benham. He was 71 years of age, a widower of 6 years, possessed of a modest house on Vicarage Lane, a mild disposition, and, as Miss Marple had observed over several decades of parish life, an exceptionally precise memory for figures, dates, and the kind of small administrative details that most people preferred not to examine too closely. He had been, in the quiet language of the village, a man who knew things, not in any dramatic or threatening sense, simply that Reginald Winfield, over 40 years of sitting at a clerk's desk, had passed documents across it that bore the names and intentions of a considerable number of local families. He had never spoken of these matters. He was far too well bred for that. But people had always been aware, in the way one is aware of a particular piece of furniture in a room, that he was there and that he remembered. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful economy of movement she had developed over recent winters and crossed to the window. The lane outside was empty. A bicycle leaned against the post office wall unlocked, as it always was on Wednesdays when young Tommy Peake delivered the late post. She noted, without particular comment to herself, that Mr. Winfield had boarded the 9:47 every second Thursday for the past 4 months. She knew this because she had seen him from this very window, walking toward the Halt with his leather case, always at 25 minutes past 9, always wearing his good grey overcoat. Last Thursday she had not seen him pass. She had assumed he had taken an earlier service. She had not, she reflected now, asked herself why he might have changed a habit of 4 months' standing. That, she thought, settling back into her chair and retrieving her knitting, was precisely the sort of small discordant note one ought never to ignore. Chapter 2. The Stationmaster's Memory. The following morning arrived with the particular grey determination of mid-March in the English countryside, not quite willing to commit to rain, yet unwilling to offer anything so generous as sunshine. The frost had softened overnight into a pale dampness that clung to the hedgerows and turned the lane outside Miss Marple's cottage into a ribbon of dark, reflective mud. Miss Marple had been awake since 6. By 7:30 she had breakfasted on toast and a softly boiled egg, written 2 letters, one to her nephew Raymond, which she had no intention of posting until the matter presently occupying her mind was rather more settled, and one to the secretary of the St. Mary Mead Ladies Horticultural Society regarding the annual spring bulb order, which she posted immediately. By 8 o'clock she had put on her good wool coat, the one with the deep pockets that accommodated both her reading glasses and a small notebook without any unseemly bulging, and had set out along the lane in the direction of St. Mary Mead Halt. The station, if it could be called such with any generosity, consisted of a single platform, a timber waiting shelter whose roof had been leaking since 1947 without anyone taking decisive action, a small office occupied by Mr. Harold Pritt, the stationmaster, and a black iron bench upon which, in finer weather, old Mr. Cathcart liked to sit and read his newspaper between the hours of 10 and noon. Mr. Cathcart was not there this morning. The bench was beaded with moisture and entirely unoccupied. Mr. Pritt, however, was very much present. He was a compact, careful man of perhaps 55, with the slightly compressed expression of someone who had spent a professional lifetime managing small but persistent irregularities, late arrivals, mislaid parcels, passengers who disputed their change with a confidence entirely unsupported by arithmetic. He was, Miss Marple had always thought, rather like a well-maintained clock, reliable, slightly rigid, and quietly resentful of anything that disrupted his mechanism. He looked up from his logbook as Miss Marple pushed open the office door, and the expression that crossed his face was one she recognised immediately, the particular blend of mild surprise and resigned courtesy that men of Mr. Pritt's generation invariably produced when confronted with an elderly woman who appeared to have arrived with a purpose. "Miss Marple," he said, setting down his pen. "Cold morning." "Very," she agreed pleasantly, settling herself into the single wooden chair that occupied the corner of the office, as though she had been invited to do so, which she had not. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment, Mr. Pritt. I have been so terribly distressed to hear about poor Mr. Winfield." Mr. Pritt's expression adjusted itself into something appropriately solemn. "Dreadful business," he said. "Dreadful. A good man." He was indeed. Miss Marple folded her hands over her bag. "I believe he travelled on the 9:47 quite regularly these past months. You must have known him to see at least." "Every other Thursday, regular as you like," said Mr. Pritt, with the faint pride of a man whose profession rewards the observance of patterns. "Always the same. 28 minutes past 9 onto the platform. Bought his ticket each time rather than a monthly. I always thought that a little unusual for a man of regular habits, but there it is." Miss Marple thought that rather interesting indeed, but allowed nothing of this to disturb the mild, sympathetic attentiveness of her expression. "I suppose the police have spoken with you," she said. "Inspector Slack came yesterday afternoon." Mr. Pritt's tone carried the faint compression of a man who's been interviewed by Inspector Slack and found the experience unrewarding. "Asked whether I'd noticed anything unusual. I told him what I told everyone. Mr. Winfield boarded as normal, took his usual seat in the last carriage, and that was the last I saw of him." "The last carriage," Miss Marple repeated gently. "Was that his customary preference?" Mr. Pritt considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Generally, yes. He once mentioned to me, making conversation while he waited, you understand, that he preferred the rear of the train because it was quieter, fewer people boarding at the intermediate stops." "Quite understandable." Miss Marple paused, as though the next question were merely an afterthought. "And was the last carriage particularly quiet that evening? I imagine the 9:47 carries very few passengers on a Thursday night." "5 in total, by my count at departure," said Mr. Pritt. He had the slightly gratified air of a man whose logbook had already answered this question, and who was pleased to demonstrate the fact. 2 ladies from the Mothers' Union returning from their committee meeting in Denton, they sat together in the second carriage. A young man I didn't recognise, dark overcoat, no luggage to speak of, who boarded at the last moment and went directly to the rear. And Mr. Simmons from the ironmonger's, who fell asleep in the first carriage before we'd even cleared the platform, if you'll forgive my saying so." "That accounts for 4, said Miss Marple. Mr. Pritt looked momentarily uncertain. "So it does," he said, with the slight discomfort of a man whose arithmetic has been quietly corrected. Well, Mr. Winfield himself, of course. That's 5. Of course, said Miss Marple warmly. And this young man in the dark overcoat, the one who went to the rear carriage, had you seen him before? Not that I recall. Mr. Pritt frowned. Youngish. 30, perhaps 35. He paid in cash, kept his collar turned up, which I thought a little affected. It wasn't raining at that point. No, agreed Miss Marple. It wasn't raining until nearly 11. She allowed a small pause to settle comfortably between them. One other thing, Mr. Pritt, and then I shall leave you in peace. Mr. Winfield's leather travelling case. I understand it was found with him? It was on the seat beside him, said Mr. Pritt. Closed and latched. The police took it away. Closed and latched, Miss Marple murmured. How very neat. She rose from the chair with the unhurried composure of a woman who had obtained precisely what she came for. Thank you so much, Mr. Pritt. You've been most helpful. She was nearly at the door when she paused, as though something had only just occurred to her. A habit so well practised it had long since ceased to require any conscious performance. The young man with the dark overcoat, she said. When the train arrived at Much Benham, I don't suppose anyone noted whether he alighted there, or whether he left at one of the intermediate stops. Mr. Pritt opened his mouth and then closed it again. Do you know, he said slowly, I couldn't say, and I find that I rather should be able to. Miss Marple smiled at him with great kindness. Yes, she said, that is rather the point, isn't it? She stepped out onto the damp platform, turned up her collar against the grey March air, and walked back along the lane toward the village with the quiet, unhurried step of a woman who had just added a second and considerably more troubling discordant note to her ledger. The leather case had been closed and latched. Reginald Winfield, in Miss Marple's experience of the man across 30 years of parish life, kept his travelling case unlatched during a journey. He had a habit, she had observed it twice at the station and once on the train itself, of reaching into it periodically for his reading spectacles, his handkerchief, or the small tin of boiled sweets he invariably carried. A man does not latch his case in the middle of a journey. Someone else, however, might very well latch it afterward. Chapter 3. Tea at the Vicarage. The vicarage in St. Mary Mead occupied a position of some architectural authority at the end of Church Lane, a solid red brick Edwardian building that had been designed with considerably more confidence than warmth, and which had been softened over the decades by an accumulation of climbing roses, a persistently overgrown front path, and the general domestic atmosphere generated by the Reverend Thomas Clement and his wife Margaret. Mrs. Margaret Clement was, in Miss Marple's considered assessment, one of the most comprehensively informed people in the village. This was not because she was nosy. Mrs. Clement would have been genuinely distressed by such a suggestion. It was simply that the vicarage functioned, in the social ecology of St. Mary Mead, as a kind of clearing-house for human difficulty. People brought their troubles there in the same instinctive way they brought outgrown clothing for the jumble sale, and Mrs. Clement received both with the same practical, unembellished kindness. The result was that very little occurred in the parish, without eventually passing through her sitting-room in some form. Miss Marple had telephoned at 9:30 and been invited for 11 o'clock. The sitting-room was warm and slightly cluttered in the comfortable manner of rooms that are genuinely lived in rather than arranged for visitors. A cat of advanced age and considerable self-possession occupied the best chair by the fire and had to be diplomatically relocated before Miss Marple could sit down. Mrs. Clement poured tea from a large brown pot and set out a plate of shortbread with the no-nonsense generosity of a woman for whom hospitality was a practical matter rather than a performance. It's a very sad business about Mr. Winfield, she said, settling into the chair opposite. Thomas took it rather hard. He'd known Reginald for years, of course. He was a sidesman here for some time before his eyesight made the steps. Difficult. A very faithful parishioner, Miss Marple agreed. Mrs. Clement, I hope you won't think me impertinent. I find I cannot quite settle in my mind the idea that it was simply his heart. He always seemed so very steady. Mrs. Clement's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the slight adjustment of a woman deciding how much of what she knows it is appropriate to say. Miss Marple, who had been observing such adjustments for the better part of 7 decades, waited with serene patience. He hadn't been quite himself these past months, Mrs. Clement said at last, in the careful tone of someone choosing their words as one chooses footing on uncertain ground. Thomas noticed it first. Reginald had always been so contained, if you know what I mean. Everything in its proper place, but since Christmas he'd seemed distracted, watchful, almost. Watchful, Miss Marple repeated. In what sense, would you say? Well, Mrs. Clement reached for her teacup. He came to Thomas in January. Not a formal visit. He simply appeared at the back door one afternoon, which was most unlike him. He and Thomas spoke privately for nearly an hour. Thomas wouldn't tell me the substance of it, naturally, which is as it should be. She paused. But afterward, Thomas was quiet for the rest of the evening in the way he is when something has troubled his conscience, without giving him any clear direction about what to do. Miss Marple set down her shortbread. How very interesting, she said quietly. I thought perhaps it was a matter of the will, Mrs. Clement continued. Reginald had no children, as you know, and his sister in Torquay is not in good health. One does wonder about these things at his age, but it felt like more than that. Did Mr. Winfield have many visitors in recent months, to your knowledge? Mrs. Clement considered this. His niece came down from London in February. Eleanor Marsh, she was before she married. A capable sort of woman, she stayed. 2 nights, I believe. And there was someone else. She frowned slightly, the frown of a woman accessing a memory she hasn't previously had cause to examine. In late January or early February, a man, I saw him myself, leaving Reginald's front path on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't recognise him, which is unusual in itself. I do know most people hereabouts, or at least know their faces. Can you describe him? Miss Marple asked. Youngish, said Mrs. Clement. 30 or thereabouts. Dark coat. He walked quickly, not rudely, but purposefully, the way people do when they want to give the impression they simply happen to be passing through rather than having come from a specific place. She picked up her teacup. I remember thinking it an odd time of year for a casual visit. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the composed stillness of a woman filing a document in a very well-organised cabinet. A young man in a dark coat. Visiting Reginald Winfield's home in late January. Boarding the 9:47 at the last possible moment on the evening of Mr. Winfield's death. Collar turned up, no luggage, cash payment. She was reminded with some precision of a young man she had known of, not personally, but by thorough village report, some years ago in a matter involving a disputed inheritance and a series of letters that had been written but never quite sent. He had also moved quickly, and with that particular quality of purposefulness that, on closer examination, resolved itself into anxiety. Mrs. Clement, she said in a tone of mild, almost apologetic inquiry, did Mr. Winfield, to your knowledge, have any professional connection, past or present, with a family by the name of Grayson? The teacup in Mrs. Clement's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone less attentive might easily have attributed it to nothing more than a slight awkwardness of grip. Grayson, Mrs. Clement said. Now why does that name... She stopped. Something moved behind her eyes with the quality of a door being carefully, quietly closed. I'm not sure that No, I don't think so. She smiled pleasantly and offered more shortbread. Miss Marple accepted a piece with equal pleasantness, and noted in the precise ledger of her mind that Mrs. Clement, who was in all her years of acquaintance one of the most naturally forthcoming women she had ever known, had just told her a deliberate and carefully constructed untruth, which meant that the name Grayson was not a thread to be followed. It was rather a door, and somewhere on the other side of it, she suspected, was the reason Reginald Winfield had boarded the 9:47 on a Thursday evening for 4 consecutive months, and the reason he would never board it again. Chapter 4. The Solicitor's Office. Much Benham presented itself to the arriving visitor with the mild, self-satisfied air of a town that considered itself several important degrees more significant than the villages it administered. Its high street offered a chemist, a draper, 2 competing greengrocers, a bank of red sandstone solidity, and, occupying the upper floor of the old market building at the far end, the offices of Hartley & Sons, solicitors, whose painted sign had weathered to the precise shade of respectability that only decades of quiet professional authority can produce. Miss Marple arrived on the 10:43 service from St. Mary Mead Halt. She had dressed with some care, not the comfortable wool coat of her station visit, but her better navy blue, the one she reserved for occasions requiring that she be taken seriously by people who were professionally inclined to dismiss her. She carried her good leather bag and had pinned at her collar a small brooch in, the shape of a pansy, which had belonged to her mother and which she wore in private acknowledgment whenever she anticipated a conversation that would require more patience than it appeared to deserve. The offices of Hartley and Sons were reached by a narrow staircase of dark oak that creaked on the 3rd and 7th steps. Miss Marple noted this automatically and without particular relevance, though she had learned, over a long life, that the automatic observations are frequently the most useful ones. The reception room contained a young woman at a typewriter, 2 leather chairs of the variety designed to discourage prolonged occupation, and a portrait of a gentleman who had presumably been the original Hartley, regarding the room with an expression of permanent, slightly dyspeptic authority. Miss Marple gave her name, mentioned that she had been a client of the late Mr. Hartley Sr. in connection with a small property matter some years ago, which was perfectly true, and inquired whether Mr. Gerald Hartley might spare her 10 minutes at his convenience. She waited 11 minutes, which she spent in a manner that appeared to consist entirely of mild contemplation of the portrait, but which in fact involved a thorough observation of the reception room, the young woman at the typewriter, and the quality of the sounds emanating from behind the 2 closed doors that led to the inner offices. From behind the door on the left came the steady, unhurried scratch of a pen, someone working through correspondence with the methodical calm of a person whose professional conscience is entirely clear. From behind the door on the right came silence of a rather different quality. The silence of a room in which someone is sitting very still and thinking very hard. It was the door on the right that eventually opened. Mr. Gerald Hartley was perhaps 45, with the kind of lean, carefully maintained appearance that suggested a man who took his professional presentation seriously without quite relaxing into it. He had his father's precise mouth and rather more of his own generation's guardedness behind the eyes. He shook Miss Marple's hand with the correct degree of warmth, cordial but measured, and led her into his office, which was lined with deed boxes in the manner of all such offices and contained, on his desk, a file that he closed with a motion just slightly too deliberate to be entirely natural. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into his chair. "You were a client of my father's, I understand." "A very minor one," she said pleasantly. "A small matter regarding my cottage. It was resolved very satisfactorily. Your father was a most thorough man," she paused, "as was Mr. Winfield, I believe." Something in the quality of Mr. Hartley's attentiveness shifted in the way that a well-tuned instrument shifts when a particular note is struck. "Reginald was with this firm for a great many years," he said after a moment. "His death is a considerable loss to us, quite apart from the personal dimension." "I'm sure it is," said Miss Marple. "He was a man of exceptional memory, I always thought. One felt, speaking with him, that nothing was ever entirely forgotten." "He was meticulous," Mr. Hartley agreed, in the tone of a man who has selected his adjective with some care. "I wonder," said Miss Marple, allowing her gaze to drift with apparent vagueness toward the window, "whether his recent visits to Much Benham, he came every other Thursday, I believe, were connected with some outstanding matter he was tidying up. He had been retired some years, hadn't he? It seemed rather dedicated of him to continue making the journey." The pause that followed was not long. It was, however, of a kind that Miss Marple had encountered before, the pause of a man rapidly assessing how much an elderly woman in a navy coat could reasonably be expected to know, and concluding, as people invariably did, that the answer was very little. "Reginald retained a small consultancy arrangement with the firm after his retirement," Mr. Hartley said smoothly. "Certain long-standing client files benefited from his particular familiarity. He came in periodically to review documents. Nothing more than that." "How sensible," said Miss Marple warmly. "Continuity is such a comfort in professional matters, isn't it? Particularly with older families whose affairs have a certain history." She settled her bag more comfortably on her lap. "I don't suppose the Grayson family were among those he assisted with." The change was so slight that it would have been entirely invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. A fractional tension in the jaw, a barely perceptible stillness in the hands, which had been resting with practiced ease on the arms of his chair. "I'm not able to discuss specific client relationships," Mr. Hartley said. With the smooth, reflexive ease of a man deploying a professional shield he has used many times before. "Of course not," said Miss Marple immediately, with every appearance of having only just realised she had asked something inappropriate. "How very foolish of me. I do beg your pardon." She rose, thanked him for his time with genuine-seeming warmth, and was almost at the door when she turned, as she had turned at the station 2 days prior, and would turn again when circumstances warranted, with the expression of a woman struck by a sudden and entirely trivial afterthought. "That staircase," she said, "the 3rd and 7th steps, they creak most alarmingly. Has that always been the case, or is it a recent development? Mr. Hartley looked momentarily puzzled by the apparent irrelevance. As long as I can remember, he said. Since my father's time, at least. I thought as much, said Miss Marple pleasantly. One does get to know a building's habits, doesn't one? Rather like people in that respect. She smiled at him with the complete benevolence of a woman, thinking about nothing in particular, and descended the staircase with careful attention to the 3rd and 7th steps. On the pavement outside she stood for a moment in the thin March sunshine, and considered what she had learned. Mr. Hartley had not denied knowing the name Grayson. He had hidden behind professional privilege instead, which was a considerably more informative response than a simple denial would have been. A man who does not recognise a name says so. A man who recognises it rather too well takes refuge in procedure. Mrs. Clement had lied outright. Mr. Hartley had retreated behind propriety. 2 people in 2 days, both of comfortable respectability, both of established village and professional standing, both responding to a single name with the particular quality of alarm that Miss Marple associated not with guilt of the direct kind, but with something she considered in certain respects more dangerous. The alarm of people who know something they have decided for reasons that seem entirely reasonable to themselves is better left unknown. She turned up her collar, consulted the station timetable she kept folded in her good leather bag, and noted that she had 34 minutes before the return service to St. Mary Mead. Sufficient time, she thought, to visit the Much Benham Public Library and examine the local records from approximately 15 years ago. The name Grayson had now been deflected twice. It would not, she decided, with quiet determination, be deflected a 3rd time. Chapter 5. The Records Room. The Much Benham Public Library occupied a former corn merchant's premises on the quieter end of the High Street, a low, wide-fronted building of pale limestone that had been converted in 1931, with considerable civic enthusiasm and a budget that had not quite stretched to adequate heating. The reading room retained, in consequence, the particular chill of a space that has been intellectually improved without being made physically comfortable, and the patrons who used it on a regular basis had developed the habit of keeping their coats on regardless of the season. Miss Marple found this entirely congenial. The librarian, a spare, precise woman of 60, named Miss Elspeth Trove, was the kind of professional whom Miss Marple instinctively respected, a person who had organised a modest institution with such thoroughness and quiet authority that it functioned, in practice, as something considerably more significant than its size suggested. Miss Trove knew, where everything was, remembered what everyone had requested, and maintained an expression of serene, non-judgmental attentiveness that Miss Marple recognised as the professional mask of a woman who had, over decades, observed a great deal more of human nature than she was generally given credit for. They had met on 3 previous occasions, twice at county library functions and once at a lecture on Elizabethan domestic records that both had attended in Much Benham's assembly room some years prior. The acquaintance was slight but mutually respectful. "Miss Marple," said Miss Trove, looking up from a catalogue she was annotating with a red pencil, "this is an unexpected pleasure." "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," said Miss Marple, settling into the chair beside the reference desk with the comfortable ease of a woman who has spent a substantial portion of her life in libraries and considers them, among the more reliably civilized of human institutions, not at all. Miss Trove set down her pencil with the decisive click of a woman who has just decided to be helpful. "What are you looking for?" "Local records," said Miss Marple. "Newspapers, primarily, from approximately 14 to 16 years ago. I'm interested in anything relating to a family named Grayson, property matters, legal proceedings, or any other public record." Miss Trove's expression did not change in any dramatic sense. But there was, Miss Marple noted, a brief pause of perhaps 2 seconds before she rose from her chair, a pause of the kind that occurs not when someone is deciding whether to help, but when someone is deciding how to begin. "The bound newspaper volumes for that period are in the records room," she said. "I'll show you." The records room was at the back of the building, small and rather airless, lined on 3 sides with shelves of bound volumes in faded cloth covers. A single high window admitted a narrow column of pale light. Miss Trove moved along the shelves with practised certainty, running her finger along the spines until she reached a section of volumes from the relevant years. "The Benham Courier is the most comprehensive local paper for that period," she said, drawing out 3 volumes and setting them on the reading table. They covered most of the significant local matters: inquests, property disputes, council proceedings. She set the volumes down and then remained standing for a moment in the way that people do when they have something further to say and are considering whether to say it. "Miss Trove," said Miss Marple gently, "I rather think you already know what I'm going to find." The librarian looked at her for a long moment, the direct, assessing look of a woman accustomed to measuring the reliability of information and the people who seek it. "The Grayson inquest," she said at last, quietly. "November, 15 years ago. It was in the Courier for 3 consecutive weeks." She paused. "It was not a comfortable business." "No," said Miss Marple. "I didn't imagine it was." Miss Trove left her to it. Miss Marple opened the first volume and found the relevant month with the efficiency of someone who has spent decades navigating index collections. The Benham Courier of that November was a modest 4-page affair, and the Grayson matter occupied in its first appearance the better part of the front page. She read carefully and without haste, in the manner of a woman extracting not merely facts, but the texture of events, the quality of what had been written around the facts, the careful language of official reporting that, to a practiced reader, frequently reveals as much by its omissions as by its content. The outline, as it emerged, was as follows. Mr. Douglas Grayson, aged 58, had been the proprietor of Grayson's Agricultural Supplies, a business of some local standing with premises on the Benham Road. In October of that year, a discrepancy had been discovered in the firm's accounts, a substantial one, running to several £1,000s, accumulated over a period of approximately 4 years. The discrepancy had been identified during a routine review conducted by Hartley & Sons following the death of Grayson's business partner. The review, Miss Marple noted, would have been conducted by the senior clerk of the firm, by Reginald Winfield. Mr. Grayson had maintained throughout the subsequent inquiry that the discrepancy was the result of clerical error, his own, committed during a period of considerable personal difficulty following his wife's illness. The inquest had returned a verdict of misadventure in connection with Mr. Grayson's death. He had been found at the foot of the stairs in his home on the 23rd of November, 3 weeks after the discrepancy was formally reported. Miss Marple turned the page with great care. The third week's coverage was briefer, largely confined to the formal conclusions and a short notice regarding the disposition of the business. But in the lower half of the page, almost as an afterthought, there was a small paragraph beneath the heading, "Family of the late Mr. Grayson." She read it twice. Douglas Grayson had been survived by his daughter, Eleanor, aged 22, and his son, Martin, aged 19. Miss Marple sat back in her chair and looked at the narrow column of pale light falling through the high window for a rather long moment. Eleanor Grayson, who had married and become someone else entirely. Eleanor Marsh, as she was before she married. Mrs. Clement had said it without any apparent awareness of its significance, in the comfortable sitting room of the vicarage over shortbread and tea. Eleanor Marsh, who had come down from London in February to visit Mr. Reginald Winfield and had stayed 2 nights. And Martin Grayson, 19 years old at the time of his father's ruin and death, who would be, Miss Marple calculated with quiet precision, 34 years old at present. Youngish, Mr. Pritt had said. 30, perhaps 35. Dark coat. She closed the volume with the careful, deliberate motion of a woman who has just fitted the second piece of a very significant puzzle into its proper position, and is now regarding the emerging picture with a mixture of clarity and a particular familiar sadness. It was not, she reflected, a complicated motive. It was, in fact, the oldest and most consistent one she knew. A son who had watched his father destroyed by a document, a process, and the meticulous professional memory of a single man, and who had spent 15 years deciding what to do about it. She thanked Miss Trove on her way out with genuine warmth, and walked to the station in the thin afternoon light with the unhurried step of a woman who now knows the shape of the thing she's looking at, even if several of its most important details remain, for the moment, carefully obscured. The 2:43 back to St. Mary Mead was on time. Miss Marple boarded it, took a seat in the second carriage, and spent the journey knitting with great concentration and thinking about the particular courage or desperation required to board a train with a settled and irrevocable purpose. Chapter 6. The Visitor at Vicarage Lane. Reginald Winfield's house on Vicarage Lane was a modest, well-kept, semi-detached of Edwardian construction, distinguishable from its neighbours by a particularly disciplined front hedge and a brass door knocker polished to a degree that suggested its owner had considered personal presentation a matter of some moral weight. The curtains in the front windows were drawn, as was proper, and a small handwritten card had been inserted into the letter slot expressing thanks for condolences and requesting that callers leave any flowers with Mrs. Partridge next door. Miss Marple did not leave flowers. She knocked. The door was answered, after a pause sufficiently long to suggest someone deciding whether to answer it at all, by a woman of perhaps 55, tall, spare, competently dressed in the manner of a person who selects their clothing for durability and suitability rather than effect. She had good bones and the kind of composed, watchful face that in another life might have been handsome, and which now carried instead the particular quality of someone who's been managing difficult circumstances for a very long time, and has become, through sheer practice, extremely good at it. "Mrs. Marsh," said Miss Marple pleasantly. A fractional pause. "Yes." "My name is Jane Marple. I live in St. Mary Mead. I was a neighbour of Mr. Winfield's in the parish sense. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to offer my condolences in person, if I may." Eleanor Marsh looked at her for a moment with the careful, measuring attention of a woman assessing an unexpected variable. Then she stepped back from the door. "Please come in," she said. The interior of the house had the slightly suspended quality of a space that has been maintained by habit, long after the animating presence has gone. Everything in its proper place, nothing disturbed, the faint smell of furniture polish and beneath it the particular mustiness of a house in which windows have not been opened for several days. A row of books stood precisely aligned on the hallway shelf. An umbrella stand contained one umbrella and one walking stick, both dry, both positioned with unconscious neatness. Eleanor Marsh led her to the sitting room and indicated a chair by the fireplace, in which a modest fire was burning with the careful economy of someone managing coal with some attention to its cost. "I've been going through his papers," she said, by way of explaining the small stacks of documents arranged on the writing desk in the corner. Her tone was neutral, not defensive, but watchful. "There is rather a great deal to organise." "I imagine so," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "It is such a particular kind of exhaustion, isn't it? Managing the practical dimensions of grief simultaneously with the grief itself." She paused. "Were you and your uncle close, Mrs. Marsh?" Something moved very briefly behind Eleanor Marsh's composed expression. Too quickly and too complex to be easily named, though Miss Marple noted it with the quiet precision of a woman who has been cataloguing such movements for the better part of 70 years. "We had grown closer in recent months," she said after a moment. There were matters we needed to discuss. Old matters. I had not seen him very frequently before last year." "Family difficulties have a way of creating distance," said Miss Marple gently, "and then, sometimes, of resolving it. It is fortunate that you had the opportunity." Eleanor Marsh looked at her hands. "Yes," she said, "fortunate." There was a quality to her stillness that Miss Marple found deeply interesting. Not the stillness of a woman at rest, but the stillness of a woman holding a very considerable number of things in careful suspension simultaneously, in the way that a juggler holds their performance steady not through ease, but through relentless, invisible effort. "Mrs. Marsh," said Miss Marple in the tone of a woman about to say something mildly conversational, "I wonder if your brother has been to the house since your uncle's death?" The suspension broke. It was not dramatic. Eleanor Marsh was far too controlled for drama. But there was an unmistakable instant of what Miss Marple could only describe as a seismic stillness, the quality of absolute internal arrest that occurs when a carefully maintained surface receives a pressure it was not prepared for. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor Marsh said. "Your brother Martin," said Miss Marple with continued pleasantness. "I wondered whether he had been informed of your uncle's death and whether he had come down." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "You know about Martin," Eleanor Marsh said. It was not quite a question. "I know something of the family history," said Miss Marple quietly. "I know about your father, and about the inquiry 15 years ago. I know that Reginald Winfield was the clerk who identified the discrepancy in your father's accounts." She paused. "And I know that a young man in a dark coat boarded the 9:47 on the evening of your uncle's death, and sat in the same carriage." Eleanor Marsh was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed, not broken precisely, but shed something. The careful professional composure remained, but beneath it something rawer and more exhausted had become audible, in the way that the structure of a building becomes visible when the decorative plasterwork is removed. "Martin has been very angry," she said, "for a very long time." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I thought he might be. Our father was not a dishonest man." The words came with the force of something said many times in private and rarely aloud. "He made errors, terrible errors, during a period when our mother was dying and he was not. He was not managing well. The money was not stolen. It was misallocated. He intended to correct it." "But the inquiry did not allow for that interpretation," said Miss Marple. "The inquiry was conducted by Hartley and Sons." Eleanor Marsh's voice was steady and precise. "Reginald Winfield prepared the documentation. The language of his report made my father's errors appear deliberate. Whether that was his intention or simply the language of professional caution, I cannot say. But my father read that report 3 days before he fell down those stairs." Miss Marple said nothing. There are moments in which silence is the only appropriate response, not because there is nothing to say, but because what needs to be said must first be allowed to settle. "I came to see Reginald in February," Eleanor Marsh continued, "because Martin had found something. A letter, in our father's papers, which we had kept all these years. A letter from Winfield to Hartley, written before the formal report, in which he described our father's conduct in considerably more charitable terms. The final report said something quite different." "The language had been changed," said Miss Marple, substantially. Eleanor Marsh looked up. "I came to ask Reginald about it directly. I did not come to threaten him. I came because I needed to understand whether it had been deliberate." "And what did he tell you?" A long pause. "He told me," she said carefully, "that the original letter reflected his genuine assessment, and that the final report had been revised at the instruction of Gerald Hartley Sr., on behalf of a client whose interests were better served by a finding of deliberate misconduct rather than misadventure." Miss Marple set down her teacup with great quietness. "A client," she said, "whose debt to your father's firm might otherwise have required repayment." Eleanor Marsh looked at her with an expression that contained, in equal and complicated measure, exhaustion, grief, and the particular hollow relief of a person who's been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and has just found, unexpectedly, that someone else can see it. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." Outside, the March light was beginning to fail. The fire had burned low. Neither woman moved to address it. "Mrs. Marsh," said Miss Marple at last, very gently indeed, "where is Martin now?" Chapter 7. The brothers are counting. Eleanor Marsh did not answer the question immediately. She rose instead, with the careful, deliberate movement of a woman buying herself a moment of composure, and attended to the fire, adding 2 pieces of coal with the precise economy of someone for whom the gesture of hospitality and the management of limited resources had long since become the same instinct. The flames steadied and brightened. The sitting room, which had been acquiring the particular chill of early evening, reasserted a degree of warmth. She returned to her chair and folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who has made a decision, though Miss Marple could not yet determine precisely what that decision was. "Martin is in Much Benham," she said. "He has been staying at the railway hotel since Monday." "Since the day after your uncle's death," said Miss Marple. "Yes." "Has he spoken with the police?" "Inspector Slack came to the hotel yesterday morning." Eleanor Marsh's expression carried a brief, involuntary flicker of something that might, in less restrained circumstances, have become contempt. "Martin told him he had been visiting the area for professional reasons. He works in property surveying, and that he had heard of Mr. Winfield's death through the village and had remained out of a general sense of, he said, family connection, I believe, though Reginald was not, strictly speaking, a blood relation. Inspector Slack accepted this." "Inspector Slack," said Eleanor Marsh, with the measured precision of a woman delivering a verdict she considers entirely accurate, "appeared principally interested in confirming that the death was a medical matter and concluding his involvement as efficiently as possible." Miss Marple made no comment on this, though her expression suggested she found it entirely consistent with her own experience of Inspector Slack's investigative priorities. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I hope you will answer me with equal directness. When you came to see your uncle in February, when he told you about the original letter and the revised report, did he seem frightened?" Eleanor Marsh considered this with the seriousness it deserved, in the manner of a woman who understands that imprecision at this particular moment would be a form of negligence. Not frightened, she said slowly. Burdened. There is a distinction. He had been carrying the knowledge of what had been done for 15 years, and I believe, that my arrival with the letter represented something he had perhaps been expecting for some time, almost a relief, in a peculiar way. She paused. He said to me, I remember this precisely because it struck me as an unusual thing to say. He said, Eleanor, I have been meaning to make a proper accounting, and I find I have left it rather late. A proper accounting, Miss Marple repeated softly. I thought at the time he meant a legal matter, a statement perhaps, or an amended document of some kind. He mentioned that he had been in correspondence with a solicitor in London, not Hartley and Sons, someone entirely separate, about the possibility of making a formal record of what he knew. Miss Marple absorbed this with the still attentive quality of a woman to whom a significant piece of a picture has just been delivered. And the leather travelling case, she said. Do you know what he carried in it on his Thursday visits to Much Benham? A pause. Documents, I believe. He mentioned reviewing files at Hartley and Sons, the consultancy arrangement. But in February he told me that he had also been removing certain items, carefully and over time, documents that he felt should not remain solely in Gerald Hartley's keeping. He was building a record, said Miss Marple. Yes, I think that is precisely what he was doing. And Martin knew about this. The pause this time was of a different quality. The pause of a woman arriving at the boundary of what she's prepared to say, and making a final determination about whether to cross it. I told Martin about the letter in January, Eleanor Marsh said. I had found it in December, in a box of our father's papers I had never fully sorted. I told Martin because it seemed wrong not to, after so many years of his anger having no proper object. He had always been angry in a general way, at the world, at the unfairness of it. I thought that knowing the specific truth might settle something in him. She stopped. It did not settle something in him, said Miss Marple quietly. No. The single syllable carried 15 years of knowledge in it. Martin has always been. He was 19 when our father died. 19, and he had watched everything. The inquiry, the report, our father's face when he read it, the 3 days between the reading and the stairs. Her voice remained steady with visible effort. He has never in all the years since been able to lay it down. And when you told him that Reginald Winfield had prepared the original document and that the revision had been made at Hartley's instruction, he asked me for Winfield's address, said Eleanor Marsh. I did not give it to him. I told him I would handle it, that I would go myself, speak to Reginald directly, try to establish the truth properly and through proper channels. She looked at her hands. He agreed, or I believed he agreed. But he found the address independently, said Miss Marple. He came to Vicarage Lane in late January. I didn't know until afterward. Mrs. Partridge mentioned to me when I arrived in February that a young man had called on Mr. Winfield the previous month. By the time I came, Reginald already knew Martin had been. He didn't tell me what had passed between them. He seemed, not frightened, but watchful, as Mrs. Clement apparently observed, as though he had recalculated something. Miss Marple thought of a man buying single tickets rather than a monthly pass, a man who had been making careful preparations over several months, a man carrying documents out of a solicitor's office, piece by piece, on every other Thursday. A man who had perhaps understood, after Martin Grayson's visit, that his proper accounting needed to be completed with some urgency. Mrs. Marsh, said Miss Marple, with the gentleness of a woman delivering something she knows will be difficult to receive, I believe your uncle was poisoned. I believe the post-mortem, if conducted with sufficient specificity, will find evidence of digitalis in quantities inconsistent with natural cardiac failure, and I believe that the leather travelling case, which was found closed and latched, though your uncle never latched it during a journey, contained documents that are no longer in it. Eleanor Marsh had gone very still. The police have the case, she said. They do, said Miss Marple. Though whether Inspector Slack has thought to examine its contents with any particular attention is, I confess, a matter I consider somewhat uncertain. She rose from her chair with the careful economy that her joints required in cold weather. I think it is time I spoke with someone whose attention to detail I find rather more reliable. She collected her bag and her gloves with the unhurried composure of a woman who has just determined her next 3 moves and finds them, on balance, manageable. "There is one thing more I need to know," she said, pausing at the sitting-room door. "The documents your uncle was carrying out of Hartley's office, the formal record he was building. Did he tell you where he intended to deposit them ultimately? Who the London solicitor was?" Eleanor Marsh looked up at her with an expression that had moved, over the course of the past hour, from wariness through exhaustion to something that contained, cautiously and not without pain, the first faint quality of trust. "His name is Pemberton," she said. "David Pemberton, Chambers and Gray's Inn." Miss Marple nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then," she said, "there may yet be a proper accounting after all." She said good evening to Eleanor Marsh with genuine warmth, stepped out into the dark of Vicarage Lane, and stood for a moment in the cold night air with the particular quality of stillness she reserved for moments when the shape of a thing had become, at last, entirely clear. The question was no longer what had happened. The question was now what precisely could be proven. And what, she thought, walking carefully along the unlit lane toward the village, ought to be done about a young man sitting in a hotel in Much Benham, waiting to discover whether the world had finally noticed what had been done to his father. Chapter 8. The Inspector's Reluctance. The Much Benham police station occupied a squat, pebble-dashed building on Cranton Street that had been constructed in 1934 with the functional grimness of an era that considered architectural modesty a civic virtue. Its front desk was manned, on the morning of Miss Marple's arrival, by a young constable of perhaps 22, who possessed the slightly startled expression of someone who had not yet fully reconciled himself to the gap between the police work he had imagined and the police work he was actually required to perform, which consisted largely of lost property reports and the occasional dispute between neighbouring farmers about boundary hedges. Miss Marple gave her name with pleasant clarity and asked to speak with Inspector Slack. The constable disappeared through a door and returned after 3 minutes with the slightly compressed expression of a young man who has delivered an unwelcome message and been given an unwelcome response to it. "The inspector says he's rather occupied this morning, Miss Marple, but if you'd like to leave a message—" "How very kind," said Miss Marple, settling into the single waiting chair with the serene finality of a woman who has no intention whatsoever of leaving a message. "I shall wait." She waited 22 minutes, during which she knitted 4 rows of the second sleeve and observed, with quiet interest, the comings and goings of the front desk. A farmer reported a missing tractor part. A woman inquired about a bicycle. A young man in a postal uniform delivered a package and exchanged pleasantries with the constable about the previous Saturday's football result. At the end of 22 minutes, Inspector Slack appeared. He was a broad, impatient man of 50, with the permanently slightly aggrieved expression of someone who considers the world chronically inefficient, and himself the primary victim of this inefficiency. He had been, in Miss Marple's experience of him across several years and several matters, neither stupid nor imaginative, a combination that made him simultaneously more reliable and more limited than either quality alone would have produced. He was good at the obvious, he was poor at the oblique. He looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man who has been hoping she might have left. "Miss Marple," he said, "I understand you wanted a word." "Just a few minutes of your time, Inspector," she said, rising with unhurried composure. "I think you will find it worthwhile." He led her to a small interview room that smelled of old tea and institutional paint, and sat across the table from her with his hands flat on the surface in the manner of a man establishing that his patience is a finite and already partially depleted resource. "It's about Mr. Winfield, I take it," he said. "It is," said Miss Marple. "I want to speak with you about the post-mortem findings, if I may." Slack's expression settled into something between professional caution and faint condescension. "Natural causes, Miss Marple. Heart failure. Dr. Croft was very clear on that point. The man was 71 with a history of—" "Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "did Dr. Croft conduct a specific toxicological analysis, or was the finding based on a general examination?" A pause. Slack's hand shifted very slightly on the table. "The circumstances didn't suggest—" "No," said Miss Marple. "They were arranged so that they would not suggest anything of the kind. That was rather the point." She opened her bag and produced the small notebook she carried in her good wool coat, consulting it with the composure of a woman reviewing her own minutes. "I should like to draw your attention to several matters. First, Mr. Winfield's leather travelling case was found closed and latched. Mr. Winfield did not latch his case during a journey. This can be verified by Mr. Pritt at the station, and by at least 2 other regular observers. Someone latched it after his death, which means someone was in that carriage and handled his belongings. Slack opened his mouth. Second, Miss Marple continued, with the pleasant composure of a woman who has anticipated interruptions and declined to accommodate them. A young man in a dark coat boarded the 9:47 at the last possible moment, paid in cash, and proceeded directly to the rear carriage where Mr. Winfield was seated. Mr. Pritt cannot confirm whether this individual alighted at Much Benham or at an intermediate stop, which suggests he departed before the terminus, specifically, I believe, at Denton Halt, which is unstaffed on weekday evenings, and where no record would be made of a departing passenger. She turned a page in her notebook. Third, this young man has been identified as Mr. Martin Grayson, currently resident at the Railway Hotel in Much Benham, who is the son of a man whose professional ruin 15 years ago was directly connected to documentation prepared by Mr. Winfield in his capacity as senior clerk at Hartley & Sons. Slack was very still. Fourth, said Miss Marple, Mr. Winfield had been systematically removing documents from the Hartley & Sons archive over a period of several months, building what I believe was intended to be a formal legal record of a significant professional misconduct, a record which, I am told, was intended for a solicitor named Pemberton at Gray's Inn in London. The travelling case, Inspector, almost certainly contained documents of this nature on the night of Mr. Winfield's death. I would very strongly recommend examining its current contents and comparing them against the records held at Hartley & Sons. She closed her notebook. And fifth, she said, with the quiet precision of a woman saving her most significant point for its most effective position, digitalis, extracted from foxglove, which grows in considerable abundance in cottage gardens throughout this parish, produces, in sufficient quantity, symptoms entirely consistent with cardiac failure in an elderly patient. It can be administered discreetly in a hot drink, in a sugar preparation, or in a boiled sweet. It would not be detected in a standard post-mortem examination, unless specifically tested for. I believe Mr. Winfield was offered something, a sweet perhaps, or a small flask of something warm, by a fellow passenger during the journey, and that he accepted it without suspicion, as a man of his generation and disposition would naturally do when offered a small courtesy by a stranger. The silence in the interview room had acquired a distinctly different quality from the silence at its beginning. Inspector Slack looked at her across the table with the expression of a man experiencing 2 competing internal conditions simultaneously: the professional resistance of someone disinclined to have his conclusions revised by an elderly woman with a notebook, and the dawning, deeply uncomfortable recognition that the elderly woman with the notebook has just laid out a more coherent account of events than he himself has managed to produce. The second condition was winning, though it was doing so against considerable opposition. "The boiled sweets," he said at last slowly. "Winfield's tin. It was in the case. We logged it." "Was it examined for contents?" said Miss Marple. A pause of the most informative kind. "I'll need to make some inquiries," Slack said, in the tone of a man retreating to procedural language as a dignity-preserving measure. "Of course," said Miss Marple warmly. "I would also suggest with respect that Mr. Martin Grayson be asked to account for his movements between St. Mary Mead Halt and Much Benham on the evening in question rather more specifically than appears to have occurred in your initial conversation with him." She rose, collected her bag, and drew on her gloves with neat, unhurried precision. "An inspector, the documents, whatever is currently in that travelling case, I think you will find it considerably less than what Mr. Winfield was carrying when he boarded." She paused at the door. "The missing documents are the motive made material," she said quietly. Someone needed Mr. Winfield's silence before his proper accounting could be delivered to Mr. Pemberton in London. The question you need to answer is not only whether Martin Grayson administered the poison, it is whether he acted alone, or whether someone with a rather more established position in this community, and a rather more immediate professional interest in those documents never reaching Gray's Inn, was aware of what he intended to do. She left Inspector Slack sitting very still in the interview room, staring at the table with the expression of a man whose manageable Tuesday morning has just become something considerably more demanding. The constable held the front door open for her with automatic courtesy. "Thank you, dear," said Miss Marple, and stepped out into the pale March sunshine with the measured, unhurried step of a woman who has just done what needed to be done and is now considering what needs to be done next. Chapter 9. The Weight of Old Sins. The Railway Hotel in Much Benham was a Victorian establishment of 3 stories that had been built to accommodate the commercial travellers of a more prosperous era, and had settled, in the intervening decades, into a comfortable shabbiness. The kind that speaks not of neglect but of a building that has simply outlasted several successive ideas about what it ought to be. Its dining room served a reliable if uninspired luncheon, its carpets were worn in the precise patterns of long human habit, and its proprietress, a Mrs. Doris Fellows, was a woman of formidable observational capacity who missed very little of what passed through her establishment and discussed it with admirable thoroughness. Miss Marple arrived at 11:30. She did not ask for Martin Grayson at the desk. She asked Mrs. Fellows instead whether the dining room might stretch to a pot of tea and perhaps a biscuit, as she had come in on the train and found the morning rather colder than anticipated. Mrs. Fellows, who recognised quality when she saw it and had strong views about the proper treatment of elderly ladies, installed her at a corner table with a pot of tea, a plate of shortbread, and within 4 minutes a comprehensive account of the hotel's current guests that Miss Marple had done nothing more to elicit than sit with an expression of comfortable, interested attention. Martin Grayson, it emerged, had been resident since Monday. He was quiet, Mrs. Fellows said. Very quiet, which she offered not as a compliment but as a mild concern, in the way that landladies of experience regard excessive quietness as a category of behaviour requiring monitoring. He took his meals in his room more often than not. He had received no visitors. He went out in the mornings and returned by early afternoon. He had paid a week in advance in cash, which Mrs. Fellows considered orderly, and had asked on his first evening whether the hotel's telephone was available to guests at any hour, which she had thought an unusual question. Miss Marple thanked her with genuine warmth, drank her tea, and was considering her next move when the matter resolved itself with the sudden, slightly disorienting simplicity that occasionally characterises events which have been building toward a resolution for a considerable time. Martin Grayson walked into the dining room. He was, as Mr. Pritt had observed, youngish. 34, Miss Marple knew now, though he carried something older in his bearing. He was lean, dark-haired, with the kind of face that might have been open and pleasant under other circumstances, but had been shaped by 15 years of a particular quality of grief into something more guarded and more angular. He wore a dark jacket and carried a folded newspaper he had clearly not been reading. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple in the way that people stop when they encounter something unexpected that they cannot immediately categorise. Miss Marple looked at him with the direct, unfrightened attention of a woman who has been looking at difficult things clearly for a very long time. "Mr. Grayson," she said, "I wonder if you would sit with me for a few minutes. My name is Jane Marple. I was a neighbour of Mr. Winfield's. I have been speaking with your sister." Something moved across his face, complex, rapid, and not entirely what Miss Marple had expected. Not defiance, not the hardened calculation of a man committed to a course of action and prepared to defend it. Something more fractured than that. The expression, she thought, of a person standing at the edge of something they have been moving toward for a very long time, and who has discovered, on arrival, that it looks entirely different from this side. He sat down. For a moment neither of them spoke. Mrs. Fellows brought a second cup without being asked, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understands when an extra cup is the appropriate response to a situation, and withdrew. "She told you," Martin Grayson said. His voice was low and carefully controlled in the manner of someone who has learned, through necessity, to manage what comes out of him. "She told me a great deal," said Miss Marple, "about your father, about the letter, about what Mr. Winfield said to her in February." She poured tea into the second cup and set it in front of him with the matter-of-fact kindness of a woman for whom small domestic gestures of care are second nature. "She's trying to protect you, Mr. Grayson. She's been trying to protect you for some time, I think." He looked at the cup without touching it. "She shouldn't," he said. "It isn't her." He stopped. The stopped sentence had the quality of one that had been started many times and never satisfactorily finished. "Mr. Grayson," said Miss Marple quietly, "I am not the police. I am an old woman who has lived a long time in a small village and who has, in consequence, seen a great many things that people do to one another out of love and out of the damage that loss inflicts and out of the particular desperation that comes when the world declines to acknowledge that something wrong was done." She paused. "I understand why you came here. I understand what 15 years of watching your father's reputation stand uncorrected does to a person. I am not without sympathy for it." Martin Grayson looked at her properly for the first time. There was in his expression the faint, suspicious attention of a man unaccustomed to being spoken to in this way, without judgment performing itself as neutrality, without sympathy performing itself as distance. "But," he said. "But," Miss Marple agreed gently, "I need you to tell me the truth, not for Inspector Slack's benefit, though he will need it in due course, for your own, because I think you have been carrying something that has become heavier than you anticipated, and I think, looking at you now, that the weight of it is rather different from what you imagined it would be." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortably. "I was on the train," he said at last. "I know." I sat with him. His hands, resting on the table, tightened slightly. He knew who I was. I had been to see him in January. I told him who I was, what I knew about the letter, what I knew he had done. He didn't deny it. He said— a pause. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it, but know it isn't sufficient, and know you know it isn't sufficient, and say it anyway because there is nothing else. He looked down at the table. I had spent 15 years constructing what I would feel in that moment. It didn't feel like any of it. "No," said Miss Marple softly. "It rarely does. I got on the train because Eleanor told me he was building a record, that Hartley Senior had ordered the report changed, that there was a client whose debt our father was owed, and who had used the inquiry to escape it." The words were coming more steadily now, with the slightly exhausted quality of a man releasing something he has held under considerable internal pressure for a long time. "I wanted to see the documents. I wanted to know that it was real, that there was proof, not just a letter that lawyers could argue away. I sat with him, and I asked him directly what he was carrying in the case." "And he told you," said Miss Marple. "He showed me." Martin Grayson's voice had changed, quieter now and rougher. "He opened the case and he showed me 4 folders of documents, copies of correspondence between Hartley Senior and a man named Covell, Bernard Covell, who had owed our father's firm £11,000 at the time of the inquiry, the revised passages of Winfield's own report with Hartley's annotations in the margin, a signed statement Winfield had already made to Pemberton in London." He paused. "He said he had been meaning to do it for years. He said he had told himself it was too late, that it would only cause more pain. He said my visit in January had clarified things for him." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Mr. Grayson," she said, "Mr. Winfield arrived at Much Benham that evening deceased. I believe he was poisoned. The case was found latched, which suggests someone handled it after his death." She watched his face with careful, compassionate attention. "I need to ask you directly. Did you leave Mr. Winfield alive when you departed the train?" Martin Grayson looked at her across the small table in the quiet dining room of the railway hotel with an expression of such unguarded, exhausted honesty that Miss Marple felt the answer before he gave it. "He was alive," he said. "He was perfectly well. We spoke until Denton Halt. I got off there. He shook my hand before I left." His voice thinned slightly. "He said he hoped it would be enough. The documents. He said he hoped it would be enough for me." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Then someone else," she said carefully, "boarded at Denton Halt." Martin Grayson stared at her. "The train stops there for 4 minutes," said Miss Marple, "unstaffed on weekday evenings. A person who knew the route, who knew Mr. Winfield's habits and the contents of that case, and the urgency of preventing those documents from reaching London, would have had time enough." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Grayson, I need you to go to Inspector Slack this afternoon and tell him precisely what you have told me, every word, the documents, the conversation, the handshake at Denton Halt." She paused. "Your father's proper accounting depends upon it, and so, I rather think, does yours. Chapter 10, A Proper Accounting." The arrest of Gerald Hartley was made on a Thursday. Miss Marple considered this quietly appropriate. There was a certain fitness, she felt, in the resolution of a Thursday evening's crime, arriving on the same day of the week, as though the matter had simply required one complete cycle of its own particular calendar to find its proper conclusion. She heard the news from Mrs. Bantry, who telephoned at 9:30 in the morning with the breathless, slightly guilty enthusiasm she invariably brought to significant village developments, and who had obtained her information from the wife of the Much Benham bank manager, who had it from the constable's mother, who had been present at the post office when Inspector Slack's sergeant had made an unguarded remark to his colleague about the previous evening's activity at Hartley & Sons. The village, in other words, knew everything by 10 o'clock. Miss Marple listened to Mrs. Bantry's account with patient attention, confirmed 2 details that Dolly had got slightly wrong, and then sat for a time in her sitting room with her knitting in her lap, and the fire doing its steady, reliable work against the last of the March cold. The facts, as they had been established over the preceding 4 days with the particular grinding efficiency that Inspector Slack brought to a case once he had been pointed in the correct direction, were as follows. Gerald Hartley had boarded the 9:47 at Denton Halt on the evening of Mr. Winfield's death. He had done so by motor car, driving himself from Much Benham to the unstaffed Halt, while Mr. Winfield's train completed its intermediate stop at Lower Benham, arriving at Denton with sufficient time to board the rear carriage before the train departed. The motor car had been left on the lane beside the Halt and collected after he alighted again at Much Benham terminus, where, as a familiar and entirely unremarkable figure, his presence on the platform would occasion no particular comment. He had known Reginald Winfield's Thursday routine intimately. He had, after all, arranged it himself. The consultancy agreement, the regular visits, the careful maintenance of the fiction that Winfield's presence at the firm's offices was a matter of professional continuity rather than, as it had in fact become, a systematic dismantling of the Hartley archive from within. He had not known, until Eleanor Marsh's visit in February, that Winfield had made a formal statement to David Pemberton in London. He had not known the full extent of what Winfield had removed and copied. Eleanor's visit, which she'd conducted with complete honesty and no apparent awareness of its consequences, had informed Gerald Hartley with considerable precision of exactly how much danger he was in. The digitalis had been obtained, the police believed, through a dispensing irregularity at a chemist in Denton with which Hartley had a long-standing professional connection, a matter still under separate investigation. It had been administered in a small flask of brandy, offered to Reginald Winfield as a gesture of collegial warmth on a cold evening, and accepted without suspicion by a man who had known Gerald Hartley for 30 years and had, in his final weeks, been doing his conscientious best to repair the damage that association had caused. The documents had been removed from the case after Winfield's death, and were found, following a search authorised with rather more alacrity than Inspector Slack usually displayed, in a locked drawer of Hartley's desk at the office on the High Street, an act of concealment so straightforward that Miss Marple had found it, privately, almost poignant in its inadequacy. Frightened people she had observed across a long lifetime very rarely concealed things cleverly. They concealed them quickly, and near at hand, in the manner of a child hiding evidence of a broken ornament behind the nearest cushion. The documents themselves, Hartley Sr.'s annotated revisions, the correspondence with Bernard Covell, and Winfield's own signed statement, were now in the possession of David Pemberton at Gray's Inn, who had been contacted by Inspector Slack's superintendent with a speed that suggested someone in the chain of command had grasped the professional dimensions of the matter rather more rapidly than the inspector himself. Bernard Covell, now 73 and resident in the south of France, was subject to a separate and ongoing inquiry. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at the garden, where the first uncertain green of early spring was beginning to assert itself along the border. The tentative, determined progress of things that have been waiting a long time for the right conditions, and are now, quietly and without any particular fuss, getting on with it. She thought about Reginald Winfield, who had carried a wrong thing for 15 years and had, in the end, found the courage to correct it. She thought about the particular quality of his final weeks, the watchfulness Mrs. Clement had observed, the careful single tickets rather than a monthly pass, the systematic and patient reconstruction of a record he should perhaps have made years before. He had known, she suspected, that his proper accounting carried a risk. He had made it anyway. She thought about Martin Grayson, who had gone to Inspector Slack on the afternoon of their conversation in the railway hotel dining room and had given a full account of everything he knew. The visit to Vicarage Lane in January, the conversation on the train, the documents he had seen, the handshake at Denton Halt. He had done so with the particular quality of relief that Miss Marple associated with people who have been holding something at great internal cost and have finally been given a legitimate reason to put it down. The charge against him, if any had been contemplated, had not materialized. He had committed no crime that the law recognized, though he had spent 15 years in the private prison of one that the law did not. She thought about Eleanor Marsh, who had carried her brother's anger and her father's memory, and the weight of an injustice she had spent 15 years trying to address through proper channels, and who had inadvertently precipitated the very crisis she'd been attempting to prevent. There was a particular cruelty in that, Miss Marple reflected. The way that doing the right thing, done in the wrong order or at the wrong moment, can set in motion precisely the harm one was attempting to avert. Eleanor was not responsible for Gerald Hartley's decision. That responsibility was entirely his own. But she would, Miss Marple suspected, spend considerable time arriving at that conclusion herself. She thought about Mrs. Clement, who had lied to her at the vicarage over shortbread and tea. She had called on Margaret Clement the previous afternoon, and they had spoken frankly, more frankly than the occasion would, in ordinary circumstances, have required. Mrs. Clement had known the Grayson name because her husband had visited Douglas Grayson in the days before his death. A pastoral visit, undertaken at the family's request, about which Thomas Clement had maintained his professional silence for 15 years. She had lied not to protect herself, but to protect her husband from the reopening of a grief that had settled, imperfectly but sustainably, over the intervening years. Miss Marple understood this completely and found she could not, in any practical sense, hold it against her. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. People lied to protect the people they loved. They carried things too long and too alone. They made reasonable decisions in unreasonable circumstances and spent years living with the consequences. They occasionally, when sufficiently frightened, did terrible things to preserve what they had built, and they were capable, when the conditions were right, of a quiet and genuine courage that arrived late but arrived nonetheless. The fire had burned low. Miss Marple rose, added a piece of coal with careful economy, and returned to her chair. There was a knock at the door, Mrs. Tranter, her housekeeper, announcing that Dr. Haydock had telephoned to say he would call for tea if convenient. "Perfectly convenient," said Miss Marple, "and perhaps a few of those ginger biscuits if there are any left." She picked up her knitting, the second sleeve nearly finished now, and resumed with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a woman who has completed a necessary thing, and returned, with some satisfaction, to the ordinary texture of her days. Outside, the Marchlight was softening into afternoon. The border was green. The village was going about its business with the peaceful, slightly self-important industry that villagers have always brought to their daily affairs, and would continue to bring, long after any particular Thursday evening's trouble had been properly settled and put away. Miss Marple knitted on. The second sleeve, she noted with quiet satisfaction, was going to be exactly right. The end. The midnight train to Much Benham. Complete. Thank you for joining us for this Mystery Dear Cozy community. If you enjoyed tonight's gathering, do leave a comment below. Edward and I would love to know where in the world you listened from. Until next time, settle back and keep watching for those discordant notes.